What's up, guys? My name is Josh. Welcome back to episode 8 of FAB 201. Always nice to have you guys with me in the classroom. Today we're going to be talking about The Art of War. Not just a card, also a famous book on warfare published many centuries ago. However, it is full of wisdom, and we're going to take a look at how to apply some of the things from The Art of War to the game of Flesh and Blood. So let's get right into that. Alright, so The Art of War was written by Sun Tzu. This guy, as you can see in the picture here, was a Chinese general, a military strategist, a writer and philosopher. And his most famous work was The Art of War. Now, you might be saying, Josh, we're playing cards, we're not actually going to war here. Fair. A lot of the contents of The Art of War is not applicable to what we're doing here. However, there are many philosophies and lots of good quotes in The Art of War that can apply to many different things, such as sports, business, daily life, and in this case, card games. So let's take a look at 3 of his most famous quotes, and they're personally some of my favorite quotes as well. Alright, the very first quote we're going to look at, and perhaps the most relevant for us as players that are trying to get better at the game, is what he says about strategy and tactics. He says, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is noise before defeat. Now, strategy and tactics, these are 2 words that I have mentioned many times on this video series. If you have not watched episode 2 and episode 3, I highly recommend you go check them out because they are fundamental to all the other episodes. This is one of the reasons why I talked about tactics and strategy so early in the video series. So what is tactics? Tactics in this case is talking about your decisions on a turn-to-turn basis. In episode 2, I talk about something called the decision tree, which means when you draw your 4 cards, you look at them, you evaluate the incoming pressure from your opponent, and then you decide how best to utilize your 4-card hand to progress your strategy, which we talk about in episode 3, talking about the game state or the game plan. Strategy is another word for what is your game plan. How do you intend to win in the long run? Or what is your plan from turn 0? Maybe it changes based on, the equipment that's flipped. Maybe it changes based on some cards that you see. But so yeah, that's what tactics and strategy are. If you haven't watched episode 2 and episode 3, I highly recommend you go watch them because they're very relevant to everything going forward in this video series, okay? So, Sun Tzu said, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. So, and he also talks about tactics without strategy. So I'm going to give you 3 different examples here of strategy without tactics, tactics without strategy, and tactics with strategy. Obviously, if you're watching this video series, I hope that you never have no strategy and no tactics, right? That would be bad, right? So the fact that you're here watching a video, such a niche video on how to improve as a Flesh and Blood player, means you probably have one of these down at minimum, right? All right, so strategy without tactics. The example I wrote down here is a combo deck. Now, I could hand a player that hasn't played Viserai OTK combo or Bolton Sabers combo or the Kano double Blazing Aether combo, I could hand them the deck and tell them, all right, here's what you're going to do. You are going to generate rune chants until you get like 20 or so. And then you're going to break Bloodsheath Skeleton. You're going to play your Sonata. You're going to get a bunch of cards. You're going to use your Spellbound Creepers to give you action points. And you're just going to blow them out of the water 40-0. Okay? Or I could be like, all right, here's your Bolton deck. You're going to charge your soul to 4. You're going to put Illumina or Beacon into the arsenal. You're going to wait until you find the other one. And then you're just going to, you know, go off with your 6 Saber combo. I could tell people these things. And they could understand, okay, that's my strategy. This is what I want to do. I want to make root chants. I want to charge my soul. I want to set up Blazing Aether. However, without a lot of practice with these decks, you won't understand the tactics necessary to get to the point where you can execute your strategy. This is very, very obvious with Viserai because Viserai is a very, very difficult deck to play. Especially considering you have things like Become the Arc Knight, that's a tutor. You have Dread Triptych, things like this. Their cards are not so straightforward to do or to use in an efficient manner. And oftentimes you'll see that a Viserai player can get to maybe 10 or 15 rune chants, but they can't quite get to the point where they have enough rune chants and they have the combo piece and they just fall flat on their face because they're just under too much pressure, right? So, strategy without tactics. The example is combo decks. All right? Tactics without strategy. This is actually something I see very, very often when you take a average pilot of a deck or even a good pilot of a deck and they're playing against fatigue. If you don't understand what you need to do from turn 0, which means if you don't understand your strategy, if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing from turn 0 against a fatigue deck, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Because oftentimes the margin of victory against a fatigue deck comes down to 2 or 3 cards. If you've ever seen a good example, 2 good examples that I saw recently of this is Reinhardt against Oldhim. Now, the Reinhardt player knew how to use his hand from turn to turn. He knew how to execute a basic Blood Rush Bellow combo. However, that doesn't cut it against Oldhim. Especially if the Oldhim is built such that they're very, very fatigue focused. You need to set up, you need to be pitching your barraging beatdowns to the bottom of the deck. You need to be setting up energy potions potentially. You need to be making sure that every single time you Blood Rush Bellow, that you're intimidating 4 cards from their hand. Because if you intimidate 3 cards from their hand and they have a charged tunic, they're just going to activate their Crown of Seeds and then they'll have 2 cards in their hand to block. So understanding what you need to do strategically from turn 0 against fatigue decks is really, really, really important. And this is a clear example of tactics without strategy. Another thing that I often see is less experienced Dorinthia players playing against Guardian in general is they don't understand how they're basically going to have to play for the second cycle of the deck, generally. So that means you're going to have to pitch some of your red cards away. You're going to have to wait until the density of defense reactions is lower in their deck, and their armor has been used. If you just try to go ham with Dorinthia in the first 10 turns against Guardian, they'll shut you down pretty hard, generally, because they have a lot of defense reactions, they have a lot of armor. You have to set up a little bit to execute that kill, okay? A good example of tactics with strategy is Kano against AB5. Now, there's a very, very beautiful game at the Calling Krakow. I think it was round 11 or round 12. It was Kano against Oldhim, and it was a very, very beautiful game because we saw that the Kano understood exactly what he was trying to do. He knew that he is only going to arsenal a Blazing Aether. It was For when I was watching the game, I was a little confused. I was like, this guy really doesn't want to arsenal anything. Eventually, I figured out why he didn't want to arsenal anything. It's because he was waiting for his blazing aether. He set up multiple energy potions. He was waiting for his pitch stack. He basically executed a perfect double blazing aether combo with Aether Wildfire. Very, very beautiful game. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go watch that. All right. So let's move on to the second quote. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. So what is this talking about? This is talking about, in the context of Flesh and Blood, knowing when to block, when to attack, when to set up, and all of the combinations of those three things. All right. In episode 2, I talked about tactics, and I talked about the decision tree. And I talked about how all decisions should be based first on defense, because you have to assess what is your opponent doing and whether or not it is worth it based on your hand to block or defend or to counter or to disrupt. All right. So every single time you draw a hand, unless you're very, very lucky, not every hand is going to be complete gas, and you're not going to always have to go with every single hand. One of the common misconceptions is that I learned very quickly that Dorinthia is not an aggro deck. You draw a hand, and it doesn't have go again. Okay, that's not a aggressive hand, right? Similarly, in general, unless you're drawing, unless you have a very, very, very consistent deck, like the old Lightning Briar or the old Chain deck, you're generally playing. Most decks are actually playing either towards the control or towards the mid-range side, actually. Now, it is true that the game has gotten much, much faster in the recent sets, and in general, classes like Starvo and Viscerai, they don't really want to block much. Chain also doesn't want to block much. Lexi doesn't want to block much. However, I believe that we will see a progression either on May 2nd, or we will see a progression in the next sets towards a little bit of a slower, a game where it's going to be like at least 6 to 10 turns, right? And so when the game slows down a bit, your threat assessment skills will be tested to a greater degree, all right? Another thing that'll be tested is your equipment usage. Now, this is something, so your equipment often is your 6th or 7th card. So knowing when to pop or when to break certain equipment, knowing when to defend with them is really, really, really important, obviously, because if you're breaking that, you're really, depending on what equipment we're talking about, you're really, really committing to either winning the game on the spot like Storm Striders, or you're trying to get a massive tempo advantage back like Courage of Bladehold or Scalata or whatever, right? So that's another important point here. The third point I wrote down is that setting up for a future turn is often critical to a strategy. So not every turn is just going to be pure defense or pure offense. There will be often turns where you block a bit and then you set up a potion, you block a bit, you set up a Read the Runes, you block a bit, you put an important card into Arsenal. Because of the way the Arsenal works, you can sculpt 2-card combos very reliably. You can set up Warrior's Valor into Steelblade Supremacy. You can set up Mordred Tide into Read the Runes. You can set up a spell into Snapback. Stuff like that, right? So knowing how to utilize your hand, basically knowing when to fight and when not to fight, is very, very important. Okay? Let's move on to the third quote. Okay? This actually might be the most famous one, the one that you've heard of the most, okay? It says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, For every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Oftentimes this is shortened to know thyself and know thy opponent. Right? So this is talking a little bit more on the strategic side. And this can be translated into flesh and blood terms as understand how you and your opponent intend to win. This is something that I've said many, many, many times, because if you go into a matchup without understanding what cards are very important, defense reactions, or I think the example I used was in the Dash game, things like High Octane. These are very, very important cards. You need to keep track of them. You need to, especially, oftentimes they're 3-ofs, so they're not too difficult to keep track of, okay? We also need to talk about if we see Silver Bullet or niche cards. So the second you start seeing things like yellow unmovable, yellow turn timber, yellow cards are really where you start to go, huh, okay, so you really, really, really want this effect, huh? Right? Silver Bullet cards, these are things that, such as, let's see, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Things like Chains of Evidence or Arena's Prayers, things like that, right? If you, or maybe the best example actually is Steadfast against Wizard. All right, so these are things that if you think that they have Steadfast, you basically have to bait it out. If you're playing Kano, right, you can't just go for your Blazing Aether combo when they have Steadfast, right? The third thing I wrote down here is that the predicted deck and equipment configuration is also very important. So when you're playing, let's say if you're playing as Prism and you're playing as a Bolton, if you've played that matchup enough, you should know that in general you're going to be playing against a Raiden Bolton. You might be playing against a combo Bolton, however, the chances of that is quite small. Right? So being able to predict what your opponent will do, what cards are in their deck, is really, really important. This is why I emphasize to many people that you should, at minimum, be on FABDB, you know, looking around at the card pool. But preferably, you play a couple matches as each hero. The very first game that you play of a hero already improves your knowledge about that hero by a ton. So, and if you're practicing a deck, having at least one game against even the niche heroes, I think is very, very important, because you can learn a lot just from playing a single game. Okay? All right, so let's move to the wrap up here. All right, so we've looked at 3 very famous quotes from The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and we have talked about how to translate them into Flesh and Blood. And you could kind of summarize it as the correct application of strategy, tactics, and game knowledge throughout the battle or throughout the game will lead you to victory. It's important that you know about how to apply strategy and tactics together. It's important that you know when to fight and when not to fight. That's basically utilizing your hand. And it's also important to have game knowledge in terms of knowing your enemy and knowing yourself, knowing what your enemy wants to execute, what you want to execute, and how those two game plans interact. This is kind of a summary of some of the earlier episodes, so I highly recommend, if you haven't watched the other episodes, please go back and check them out. I think there's a lot that you can learn from those. Anyways, that basically will wrap up this episode. The next episode, we're going to be going into a couple more quotes from The Art of War, since this is a little bit of a kind of downtime before the BNR announcement. So I'm trying to do a little bit more evergreen content here. Okay? All right, so that wraps up FAB 201, episode number 8. Thank you for joining me for today's lesson. I hope that you have a good day. Take care. See ya.